Hello to our audience and welcome to another discussion around DNR, the 12th edition by the Reuters Institute of Journalism. This is the digital news report and our finding across many key countries that we've been tracking for a while. The news, unfortunately, remains grim and challenging for most news organizations and most geographies. We continue to find that digital and social platforms are taking precedence over the news organizations and their platforms themselves. That's putting pressure on the ad and subscription revenue models that many of these news organizations have. And of course, the biggest problem remains the growing disengagement of audiences across the world with the news. For different reasons, in different parts of the world, they are not attuned to the news and they're frankly not interested. That, I think, remains the stickiest part of our findings. There are some other findings, which is that newer platforms are beginning to rise and flourish, like YouTube and TikTok. In many countries, of course, in countries like India, it's banned, so it isn't present. But Facebook is now diminishing in its importance. The short point is the connection between the public and the news organizations continues to fray. What we're going to do over the next 1 hour is really explore what that means for the Asian landscape in several key countries there, including Japan and Philippines, and of course, the larger Asia findings. Let me introduce, first of all, our panelists as also authors and co-authors for this report. Lead author of the report, Nic Newman, Reiko Saisho, who is author of the DNR Japan country page. She is also senior researcher at NHK's Broadcasting Culture Research Institute. Of course, in this particular report, she has contributed in a personal capacity. And Yvonne Chua, who is author of the DNR Philippines country page. She is associate professor of journalism at the University of the Philippines' College of Mass Communication. She's been teaching on a range of topics from investigative journalism to data journalism, and she's been leading several fact-checking projects as well. It's a pleasure to have the three of you in this conversation. Thank you for joining in. Lots to talk about, so let's dive straight in. Nic, let me hand the baton to you first, and maybe we can go through the key findings.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Really good to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and sharing the data with a focus on the region, the Asia-Pacific region specifically. So just briefly, a reminder of the methodology of our survey. So it is based on online polling. So it will tend to underrepresent traditional news behaviors such as television, print, and radio, particularly when we talk about sort of cross-platform behavior. It's also important to stress we have 46 different markets, and we're covering 11 in the Asia-Pacific region. There they are, representative samples of around 2,000 in each country. It is important to stress that some of the markets, especially India in the region, but also some of the African markets, are representative of younger, more educated English-speaking groups. So it's often hard to directly compare some of these markets with markets where we have more representative samples. The survey was conducted on our behalf by YouGov in January and partners in January, early February 2023. And our work is supported by 18 different organizations, including a large grant from the Google News Initiative, broadcasters like the BBC and NHK. We have media regulators, industry organizations, academic institutions around the world as well. So as Mitali says, one of the key themes that has come out of this year's data across countries is what we're calling this fraying connection between news organizations and audiences, and particularly some audiences. So this is one illustration. This chart is one illustration of that fraying connection. It's a question we ask about what is your main access point? What is the key way, the first way in which you start your news journey? Is it directly to a news website or app? Is it via social media? Is it via search? Is it by aggregators? And what this chart shows is that across all 46 countries, direct access in the blue has fallen from 32% to 22% since 2018. And at the same time, our preference to access news via social platforms has grown by a similar amount. So platforms essentially playing a bigger and bigger role each year. Some of the other gateways remain really important, but we haven't seen so much change in those. So search is still obviously a really critical way in which people start their news journeys, along with aggregators and mobile alerts. Now, what's really interesting is these are averages, but we have very, very significant country and regional differences, particularly actually in Asian countries. So firstly, if we look at European countries, some European countries, including the UK, you can see that direct connections actually remain pretty strong. So there are still a large number of people who go directly. But then if you look at some of the Asian countries in our survey, we can see that far fewer people say they start their news journeys directly. There's 7% in Thailand, 8% in the Philippines. This is a preference. Whereas social media is much, much more important. So 64% say their main preferred gateway to news in Thailand, 64%, 53% in the Philippines. And then in other parts of the region, we see slightly different behaviors. So we have a set of countries where aggregators, news aggregators, are actually the biggest access points that often combine news and search. So Yahoo, for example, in Japan, a sort of big portal, and Taiwan as well. And then in South Korea, you have very large domestic aggregators such as Naver and Kakao, for example, and Down. So different platforms, but across most of the region, what we're seeing is that publishers in Asia just generally tend to be more dependent on platforms for traffic than in many other parts of the world. This is another way of looking at this same point, really, which is about the growing dependence on social media, but we're looking at this by age, and we're looking at by a question we ask about main source of news. So what we're doing here is comparing whether people's preference is for traditional media like television and print, or for digital media on the left, news websites and social media. And what we see in the Philippines, which is reasonably typical across the region, is this clear generational divide. So over 55s and to some extent over 45s still prefer television news. But for under 35s, it's really all about social media and digital media. And for 18 to 24s, so for that youngest group, under 25s, it's clearly very social. So in the Philippines, 43% now say that social media is their main source of news. Just as a contrast, so you've got that older and younger perspective. Just as a contrast, we can look at the position in Japan, where we also see a generational divide. Print is a little bit more important in Japan still, though it's been declining. Television still really important in general, but for those older groups. And again, for under 45s, it's digital that is the default. And then for really interesting behaviors, I think, emerging for under 25. So social media in Japan generally has been used less for news, partly because of the strength of those aggregators, which is represented by the big block on the left. But for under 25s, you can see they're increasingly not voting for those aggregators. They're voting for social media, 36%. So we see this change happening at different paces, but across the region. So social media and other platforms are becoming relentlessly more important, but it's not necessarily the same networks. This chart shows how Facebook has become less influential for news over the last few years as other networks have grown. And what you're looking at here is aggregated data for 12 countries, including Japan from the region. And we can see that 42%, for example, accessed Facebook for news in 2016, and that's fallen to just 28%. And this is partly, Facebook themselves have been pulling back from news, but it's also the sort of rise of other platforms. In particular, this year you can see it tends to be video-based platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. All three of those have grown, whereas others are either declining or flat. Interestingly, very little change in Twitter's user base in terms of reach, despite all the upheavals going on with Elon Musk's takeover. If we look across all of our markets and specifically on news, we see TikTok is the fastest growing network, but also has some of the highest usage of TikTok for news in parts of Asia. We can see Thailand there, the heaviest penetration of TikTok for news in our entire survey. Malaysia, 24%. These are figures for all demographics, not just for younger people. And also very strong in Latin America and Africa. So actually, TikTok is being used less for news in countries like the US and UK. And we've also seen the impact of that across the region in a number of elections, most recently in Thailand, where we had a new young party getting the majority of the seats and coming to power off the back, or at least getting the majority of seats off the back of a really interesting social media campaign, which involved, YouTube, TikTok, a range of different networks. So according to our survey, here are some of the top social networks in a few of the countries that we feature in our survey. So just starting with the Philippines, and we do see differences in different countries, so it's important to not just talk about the averages. So in the Philippines, Facebook remains unbelievably important for news. So 72% say they have seen news of our samples, so they've seen news in the last week using Facebook. You can also see the importance of Facebook Messenger as part of that equation. But the biggest increase in the last year is TikTok, become much more important in general, but also for news, so up 6 percentage points. If we look at Indonesia, very similar mix actually. But instead of Facebook Messenger, we see WhatsApp is actually the main platform for messaging, where news is also widely shared. And again, TikTok has grown very fast in the last year. So in many countries, we see that growth that I talked about. And then a different picture in India. So Facebook has been losing ground over the last few years in India. YouTube, the leading network for news, along with WhatsApp, which is very heavily used in India for news. TikTok, of course, is banned, which is why you don't see TikTok there, though there are very similar apps emerging where you can share vertical video, including news. And Instagram, to some extent, is picking up on some of that growth in vertical video as well. So what do we mean, however, when we say people on TikTok or other networks are using them for news? What does that actually mean? Are they actually looking at mainstream media organizations in social media, or are they looking at influencers or politicians or political activists or alternative news sources? So this is a question we came back to in our survey this year. And I think this chart tries to answer that question. It tells a really interesting story. These are averages across countries, but what we see on the left with Twitter and Facebook, when you're in Twitter and Facebook, people say that they're actually paying most attention to the dark blue line, mainstream media organizations and journalists. So journalists do lead much of the conversation in those networks, alongside, of course, alternative news sources and politicians and ordinary people who also want to have their say. But if you look on the right-hand side at some of these newer, more mobile, youth-based networks, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok, you can see that more attention is being paid to what we're calling personalities. And in the survey, we made clear that also included celebrities and social media influencers than they are to journalists, even when it comes to news. So what we've seen over the last year is that mainstream media organizations have really been piling into TikTok and starting TikTok accounts. But I think something to do with the sort of personality-driven nature of it, the culture of TikTok, actually makes it quite challenging for journalists to relate within these networks. So maybe this is something we can pick up on in the panel. Now, you may remember that last year, a lot of the headlines from our report were about this idea of selective news avoidance. So people who consume news, but also actively avoid it, or at least some of it, some of the time. And this year, we've tried to understand a little bit more about what is behind this phenomenon, but also what we can do about it. So just firstly, the overall numbers. So aggregated across 4 46 markets. It's a pretty similar number to last year. So 36% say they sometimes or often actively avoid the news. The headline numbers a little bit higher in the Philippines, India, Thailand, a little bit lower in Japan and Taiwan. And people are avoiding the news, they tell us, because they find it often negative, or there's too much about particular subjects that they are less interested in. So this year we wanted to understand more about what that avoidance looks like, and we identified two slightly overlapping groups. So firstly, about half of avoiders say they're trying to avoid all kinds of news. So the sort of behaviors that we're talking about might include listening to the radio and the news is about to come on and you switch over and then switch back once the news is finished, or people scrolling through social media and scrolling past difficult news stories, for example. And this is often linked to low interest in news and low interest in politics, we find. And then there's a second group who are interested in news, but they're taking more specific actions to reduce their news consumption. So this could be checking the news less often, for example. It could be turning off mobile news notifications, or it could be avoiding particular types of news that make them feel depressed or bring their mood down. And I think a lot of this kind of specific avoidance is really linked to just the amount of news, the negativity of the news in general, and this attempt to protect themselves from things that might make them depressed. So here's just an example, someone trying to avoid news about the economy because they find it depressing and looking for something a bit more uplifting, looking for a bit more hope. The number one subject that people said that they were avoiding, sadly, is news about the war in Ukraine, also national politics, crime and security, social justice issues. So these are all issues which we consider to be the lifeblood of, and journalists consider to be the lifeblood of what they do. And these are things that people say that they are often or sometimes trying to avoid. So what might help? What kind of news or approaches to the news are these avoiders more interested in? So this data suggests that over half of those who avoid the news sometimes or often say that they will be more interested in news that is more positive, or journalism that offers solutions, that doesn't just point out the problems, but actually points the way to something that you could do about it, for example. They are least interested in the type of news that gives sort of constant updates on the big subjects of the day. And what's interesting is that is in stark contrast with people who say that they never avoid the news, because they're most interested in those kinds of stories. They're most interested in politics, for example, and they're most likely to visit news websites as well. So there's this real challenge, I think, as many sort of websites and news channels are optimized for these sort of super users, but actually that is exactly the kind of news that is turning some other people away. So probably something that we can fix around this sort of one size fits all approach that needs to change. Every year in the report, we take the temperature on trust in the news, and in the last few years, we saw a sort of a bump in trust as during COVID, as people sort of were looking for more reliable news. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, we've seen that bump coming back down again. So overall trust is down across all 46 markets by 2 percentage points this year. And if we look at that country by country, we see trust is down in 15 countries or markets, and broadly stable in the rest. Highest level of trust, so quite a lot of variation. Highest level of trust in Finland, lowest level in Greece this year, 19%. If we look across the region, again, quite a mix from Thailand to Taiwan. But broadly, what we see across all 46 countries is trust does tend to be lower in countries with a high degree of political polarization. So those average scores tend to come down because people are seeing things in the media that they don't necessarily like. So it's not necessarily about the quality of journalism. This is about audience perceptions of that journalism and what they see in the media. To that end, we've looked this year at the link between the criticism, the amount of criticism they see of the media and of journalists, and levels of trust. And you can see in this chart, there's pretty strong correlation between the two. So the higher the level of criticism of the media, the lower the trust. Of course, this is just one factor in the very complicated issue of trust in the media. So, for example, you can see the Philippines there, high levels of criticism of the media and lowish levels of trust. When we ask people about the sources of criticism, so where do you see that criticism, we find in many countries it is politicians and political activists at the top of the list. So 42%, followed by ordinary people, celebrities, even other journalists attacking journalists. So people are more likely to mention politicians as the source of that criticism in South Korea and the Philippines, as well as the US, of course, where Donald Trump famously denigrates the media and calls them fake news. But actually, that playbook has been used across the world with politicians denigrating the work of journalists and journalists who try to hold them to account. And I should add, we also find in our survey that social media is where most people see the criticism, perhaps not surprisingly. Other reasons for low trust include, obviously, the amount of misinformation and disinformation. This is a question we ask every year about how concerned you are about what is real and fake on the internet when it comes to news. You can see the highest level of concern in Africa, levels of concern in Asia overall, fairly near the average. Though again, they tend to be much higher amongst people who are heavy users of social media. So again, that connection with social media. So turning now to the business of journalism, Mitali mentioned this at the beginning. It's been a really dreadful year in terms of layoffs and closures in many countries, including in Asian countries. We've also seen very high-profile closures of BuzzFeed News, for example, Vice filing for bankruptcy. And against that background, it's not surprising that we've seen more publishers focusing on different business models, including subscription, membership, donation. Every year, we try to track the proportion that say they pay for some kind of online news through one of those methods. And if we look across 20 countries, what we find is broadly a slowing down of growth that we've seen over the last few years, in a few cases decline as well. So, and a lot of variation again. So over a third paying for news in Northern European countries, around a fifth in the United States, but much lower in the United Kingdom. In Japan, you can see there only 9% as well. Print newspapers were very slow to embrace that move to digital and to paying in Japan, though that is changing. And overall, as I say, the average hasn't changed at all since last year, partly due to the cost of living crisis, which has made consumers more price conscious. In many countries, we find a few big winners, a few big brands taking a significant slice of the subscription pie. So the New York Times, for example, accounts for about a third of all subscribers in the US. Nikkei is a big player in Japan, for example. But we also are seeing new opportunities, I think, for niche subscriptions, for aggregator subscriptions. So in the US, for example, we see Apple News Plus really growing quite significantly over the last few years, pulling together different brands. We have individual journalists asking for donations or subscriptions through newsletter platforms like Substack. So there's a lot of really interesting diversification in business models, I think, as well. And in Asia too, a lot of experimentation with different kinds of business models. So just finally to formats and to the greater adoption of audio and video, which we talk about quite a lot in this report and over the last couple of years. And just to illustrate what's happening, we go back to a question we've asked a couple of times before about preferences. Do you prefer to access your online news in text, in audio, or in video? And if we look across all of our markets, we see that people still basically prefer to read. 57% said they prefer to read. That's because online, you're in control. It's much quicker to access the information you want. 30% say they prefer to watch, and 13% say they prefer to listen. And that's higher, quite considerably higher with younger people. partly because they have headphones on and are already spending quite a lot of time listening through apps. But what's interesting for me is the differences between countries here. So you see in many Northern European countries that very strong sort of reading tradition and preference in Finland, the United Kingdom, for example. But then in Philippines and India, you see much more interest or underlying preference in watching the news or listening to the news. So it may well be that in Asia we see very different models emerging. And we see this in television using as well. There are some interesting age differences as well. So this is the UK. You can see that under 25s are less likely to say they prefer to read, more likely to say they prefer to watch or prefer to listen. And not quite so obvious, but again, in Malaysia, we see younger people under 25s a little bit less likely to read, a little bit more likely to listen specifically. And much of this preference carries through to consumption of news videos specifically. This is global data, so across all of our markets, you can see that the bulk of online video is consumed via social platforms, especially Facebook, YouTube, particularly by younger people. You can see in the growth of TikTok there. With younger people in particular, very strong reach, and then older people are more likely to consume it on news websites. And then finally, back to listening. Obviously, we've seen a lot of investment in podcasts by publishers over the last few years, and also some increase over time. So publishers are interested because of that younger demographic profile that we talked about. But if you're talking specifically around news, just 12% across around 20 markets that we look at. So still quite a slow burn and reaching mainly upmarket audiences that are already interested in news is what we find in our data. So just some takeaways to sort of set up some of the themes that we're going to discuss in a moment. So we see significant shifts in the platforms people are using for news, driven by younger audiences in many cases, turning their attention from more legacy social platforms like Facebook to next generation ones that place more of a premium on entertainment, more of a premium on personalities, a challenge for publishers in many different ways. Secondly, that depressing nature of the news gender, the sense that people can't get away from the news, and also divisions over politics are contributing to some of this low engagement that we see in the news and selective avoidance. As we've heard, audiences quite often looking for a more positive agenda and a bit of hope. The business models, ad-based and subscription models, are under pressure, compounded by that economic downturn. And that in turn is making it harder for media to be truly independent from businessmen and powerful politicians and governments. And then finally, in terms of formats, audio and video becoming a more important part of the mix, again, driven by those preferences of younger generations, and video particularly important, I think, playing a particularly important role in Asian countries. So with that, I will hand you back to Mitali.
Nic, thank you very much for that. Increasing social media, increasing influencers, increase in audio and video, as you said. And I wonder if I heard the voice of a slightly harassed Londoner while talking about young people with their headphones on constantly, Nic. Perhaps that was the case. But, a good thing to do might be to get an eagle-eye view on what's happening with the two markets we're focused on in this discussion, which is Japan and the Philippines. Yvonne, if I could turn to you first, as someone who's been watching the news landscape for several decades now, just want a sense of you on what the broad picture looks like in the Philippines and what remains some of the biggest issues you're concerned with as you watch the way audiences are engaging with news in that country.
The report, I think, accurately reflects what's happening in the Philippines, especially in terms of how we consume the news. And really, Filipinos, global surveys have borne this out, that the consumption of video in the Philippines is extraordinarily high. The consumption of social media, whether it's for news or for other purposes, is likewise. And perhaps something to bear in mind is because our median age in the Philippines is 25. We have a very young population who, if you look at it, means that they grew up in this environment. They grew up with the devices, and they grew up with, of course, social media. Now, that it also means that we've always liked a lot of entertainment more than the news. And it hasn't really helped that over the past few years, news has increasingly becoming more negative or more polarizing because of the grim or what has been happening politically in the country. We've been through like 6 years of war on drugs, highly divisive elections. So, and Filipinos are the first to say that they've been exposed a lot to political news. And that probably explains why they want to take a break right now, why they're avoiding the news. At the same time, the trust scores in the Philippines, and we've stressed this since the Philippines became part of this project in 2020, they have been relatively lower than other countries because of a combination of other factors. One, we've known that government politicians, along with their supporters and their proxies, have been attacking the media, legitimate media, mainstream media, since 2016. Has this let up? We found that the attacks continue, and that the incidents of attacks have actually remained high even under a new leadership. So politicians, as well as others, continue to be critical. They continue to make a lot of allegations against the media, including even endangering their lives when they call them communist or terrorists, or what we call red tagging, even when there is no law that bans ideology or any organization that for its ideology. So we're very grateful. I am very grateful for that. Reuters Institute for the first time decided to probe the relationship between media criticism, which includes attacks on the media, and the low trust levels. It partly explains why we're always at the bottom of the heap when it comes to the Southeast Asian markets.
Let me just take an additional second with that, Yvonne, because you've raised many important points there. As you pointed out, and as the research in the DNR does as well, it looks documented that highest reported levels of media criticism are also where trust takes a hit. It's also important to underline, I think, that when we're looking at some of the organizations within the Philippines context, trust and trustworthiness are two different concepts that we're exploring at this point. So as you point out, there is a sense amongst the public landscape where trust in news generally is dropping. This is not to say our trust scores are pointing to the trustworthiness of a news organization, rather what the landscape as a whole looks like. If you were to point to one platform where you think attention is now increasing, and it looks like it's TikTok, Yvonne, what do you think the model and structure of that looks like? Because, part of this conversation is also for news organizations within the region to look at models that work and to look at solutions that they could explore.
What we're seeing right now, the Philippine media is really fast to respond to where they need to build their presence. And that partly explains why you find a lot of people looking for news on Facebook, because most of the brands, both big and small, can be found on Facebook. And then over the years, we have also found that a number of them are moving to TikTok. And some have done that rather successfully. They have realized that, bite-sized videos that are lighter, when we say lighter, but not more trivial, must be the way to go. However, some of them tend to, if you compare the content itself, those that are softer in nature, more fun, more light, they tend to, of course, sit better because of the younger audience that's on TikTok, compared to when some newsrooms just simply transfer, or they don't repurpose the content. They just move it from one to the other. So it just crosses the platform without much innovation or redesign. I think that's what a lot of the publishers, our news organizations, have to think about, that what fits one particular social media platform doesn't exactly work in another social media platform, and that just crossing the platforms may not be enough we really have to focus a lot on the content. Where do we get our inspiration? Maybe without sacrificing the journalistic standards, to see what storytelling devices have the personalities and influencers have been using, and maybe adopt that. I mean, even in journalism, we look to literary devices when we tell our stories. So there's nothing wrong in examining that. At the same time, we should also be mindful that, to stick to our role, and that is to continue to focus on matters of public interest. So essentially, that's how I feel about the move to TikTok.
Reiko, completely different landscape, even though it's a similar region. The median age for one gets shifted a whole lot when we're looking at Japan. What's been your observation of the last year and how people are engaging with this prickly concept that we call news? You're on mute, I think, Reiko.
Sorry. Thank you very much for having me today. And just as you mentioned now, Mitali, Japan is kind of have a unique language, and we are very introvert country, very polite, very keen to avoid controversy. So that really kind of plays into the media landscape as well. And so it might be a country quite difficult to understand from outside. But I've been looking into the DNR report this year and in the past and last year, trying to find if I could identify any similar patterns that you see in the Western countries in Japan. And one of the things I spotted was the similar pattern of the first slide Nic has shown. It's not really between the news organizations, apps and website versus social media, but because in Japan we have a large presence of aggregators, I've tried to look into what aggregators and social medias are kind of chosen amongst the 18 to 24. And that crisscrossing of that graph did indeed happen 2 years ago. So I think Nic is very right that the demographic generational changes are happening quite quietly. It hasn't really surfaced, but it is happening. And I think in the matter of a couple of years, we will be seeing more drastic changes. So on the surface, a lot of things seems to be quite stable. I think I am expecting more drastic changes to happen in our media landscape in the coming years. And also another thing that I might want to add about the trust and trustworthiness and all that political polarization. In Japan, for almost all the years after the Second World War, except for 2 years, we had one political party in government. So again, it's been quite stable political environment on the surface, but that has a drawback in a sense that the level of political interest and people's general attitudes towards kind of debating about politics is very, very low. And I'm just wondering how that plays into the trust and whether that trust level is really that trustworthiness that people have towards the media is another big question I have in mind.
No,
but very interesting read.
Thank you for raising that. There's another sort of idiosyncrasy I wanted your thoughts on about the Japanese landscape, which is that, in terms of subscriptions, Japan is amongst the lowest in the basket of richer countries. But you contrast that against the finding that Japan also has amongst the lowest levels of news avoidance. So there's an audience there that is not avoiding the news as much as other regions are, but there's also an audience that's saying, I don't really want to pay for this.
Yes, and that is actually the biggest questions I have, and I wanted to discuss with Nic and you and everybody about the relations between the news avoiders, which is, you rightly said, is quite low in Japan, but we have a massive, was it 17% of non-users who basically has ditched news altogether. And how does that come into one picture is a big question that I have. And when you talk about the fraying relationship with the media and audiences, news avoiding is, yes, it's a serious matter, but having 70% of our users basically turning away from news, to me, is even more serious, because we just don't have that relation in the first place. And how we regain that is a big question that I think the Japanese society will have to face.
Nic, I'm going to lob the ball to you to take that one on. Just a word to our audience as well. I can see a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to try and park the last 15 minutes to take them on. But for now, let's just get some of the nitty-gritties of this discussion, sort of underway. Nic.
Yeah, it's a great point, Reiko. And I think we try to sort of separate two different groups, and I think there are they're overlapping, of course, but they're two slightly different groups. There's a group of people who just don't feel the news is relevant to them, and it's partly because they also feel disconnected from other aspects of society as well, and that's happening to a greater or lesser extent. And I think that's not really something that publishers can do that much about. These is partly about news literacy and wider societal issues, actually. But then there's this other group of people who are basically just trying to deal with the very, very negative agenda that we've been through. And also just by the fact that you can't get away from news. What we're doing as publishers is just throwing more news at them to think that's the problem. And what they really want is news that's more useful to them and more relevant to them. So I think that's a problem we can do something about. And many media companies are really trying to think about how to get better balance in the news, how to provide more diverse perspectives, how to give people hope and agency. And I think that's this second group that we can focus on.
Yvonne, let me turn to you on this relationship between news and social media, which frankly exists as a large check dam at this point between news organizations and the audience. It is a stated fact that Facebook is no longer interested in sort of being very engaged with news. Yet in a market like the Philippines, people are constantly turning to a social media platform like Facebook. How do news organizations navigate that relationship with social media platforms while trying to reach an audience that they know is spilling into those little pools looking for news?
We realize that, of course, Facebook has been threatening to remove news content, right? Especially in countries that intend to introduce journalism protection acts, right? Or make them pay usage fees for the use of news. However, there's one thing I think that we should be mindful of or remember when it comes to the Philippines, that Filipinos are very social. Facebook is one way for them to connect. We have a very large diaspora that are on Facebook. And as long as we have that, there's very little reason to move away from Facebook, and news organizations are pretty much aware of that. They have to continue to be in that platform for as long as our Filipino communities overseas use that a lot. And that also explains why we have, surprisingly, Messenger as a very important way for Filipinos to connect and share their news, because they're there, they chat, they talk a lot. So that's where they do the sharing, share it to your page or share it to a community or group that you're part of. So that has to be, I think that's what news organizations know. And while the others, they see that, the influence of Facebook is waning in the Philippines, it may take a while before that really happens, given the fact that, again, for social media in general, we have a younger audience, right? We have a younger population. And number two, for Facebook, we have large communities spread across the world that have long been connected through Facebook.
Nic, you've been watching this sort of grow over the last couple of years. What have you seen in terms of the trend of audiences and video? And now what's coming into the mix is something like TikTok and influencers, which is, a whole other beast compared to news platforms streaming video on YouTube channels.
Yeah, I mean, I think the change that we're seeing is, Facebook is about friends, right? And so, as Yvonne's just said, that sort of diaspora connection that keeps Filipinos there. But in other parts of the world, we're seeing people sort of turning away from that as the primary mechanism. They want stuff that's sort of stimulating and interesting. So it's more like content recommendations, essentially. So TikTok is much more about, it's not, you don't really follow people in quite the same way. It's about the the relevance and the engagement of the content itself. And to some extent, YouTube's like that as well. So video networks work slightly differently. I think what we're really seeing is sort of just increased complexity, that people are using multiple networks, and actually they also get quite overwhelmed by the multiple networks because you're not quite sure where messages are coming from anymore. Life used to be so much simpler.
Now you really do sound like an old London
dinosaur. I sound like a dinosaur.
Reiko, let me turn to you on some of the points that you raised around audiences. One of the realities is the cost of living crisis that young people, especially world over, are facing. We're seeing it in a lot of the quotes in our report. People are unsubscribing because they're trying to cut costs and they don't think news is a priority. That's one. But the other is this sort of narrative that they're looking only for positive news, or they would like to see more positive news when they do consume it. How do you marry the two? It's not a difficult living situation. There is bad news out there. As a news organization, how do you sort of constantly strive to present positive solutions or solution-based reportage?
In Japan country data, there's again another odd data coming up saying that the people do rather prefer to see the news updates. The most unpopular element of the other countries. And I'm again puzzled to see what that indicates. But again, it's a I mean, I'm from a public broadcaster, and for us, I think it's just more voices, diversity of news, diversity of approaches is something that we have to we have to try in order to reach out to to as many people as possible. We have the universality principle. So again, it's not an easy task with limited people and limited amount of resources, but we just have to try and see what avenue, what contents work best and not, and try and see, make a balance, really. I'm sorry, I really don't have the straightforward answer.
I don't think there is one, but I think you raise an important point about diversity, which is something that came up in conversations with newsrooms in India as well, where many pointed out that audiences are often just not interested because they don't see anything of themselves in these news outlets. I'm going to pivot to some of the questions that are coming in. Nic, perhaps you could take this on. There's one about the fact that news consumption in Japan is very unique. The over 60s watch TV. It's the sort of 20-year-olds watching social media. In other countries, Nic, what are the main age groups that are paying for digital news?
In most countries, it's over 55s. So I think the average age, I think only about, in the UK, for example, only 8% of people under 35 are paying for online news. But it is slightly different in some other countries. So in the US, actually, many younger people are subscribing, and that's partly because there's more donations and the price points are quite often lower. But it's also because it's much more about you subscribe because you agree with the political stance of an organization. So it's much more of a political statement. Whereas in other organizations, it's kind of, well, I used to pay for newspapers and now I pay for online. And I think that's the real challenge for news organizations is, how do you encourage young people to see the value and find the relevance when really they don't want to be constrained by a single subscription. They love this pick and mix approach where you can take, the best content from anywhere. So I think that's why we're seeing, some really interesting trends in sort of bundling and also in terms of lower prices for very specific bits of information. I think so. Those are some of the trends that we see in payment.
Yvonne, if I can come to you on a question around media criticism, which is quite high in some countries, including yours, from ordinary people. So the question is, what do you think are the main reasons for this? I think some of that we've addressed, but also what do you suggest needs to be done for news organizations in sort of difficult environments like yours, Yvonne? Is there a way to collaborate better? Is there something to do to take on media criticism when it's coming from a powerful bloc like politicians?
In recent years, we've seen news organizations or the industry come together in order to address attacks that come from different sectors. And so you see that we have a coalition that really tracks incidents of press freedom violations. That's the Freedom for Media, Freedom for All. The National Union of Journalists of the Philippines has taken different measures, including, of course, launch a project in partnership with legal organizations in order to help journalists who have become the objects of cyber libel attacks. The red tagging, which is branding journalists as communists or terrorists. We have been lucky actually because we have not kept silent about this. Is while the administration would like to dismiss it, we still are lucky that we have a commission on human rights that constantly condemns the carte blanche approach of government to red tagging journalists. So, but this would not have been possible if the sector were not vigilant itself. So we have to be on our toes as well whenever there are attacks.
And I must add by saying that the report itself has received criticism from the government. The Undersecretary Guterres, who is Executive Director of the Presidential Task Force on Media Security, has disagreed with our report, but the Reuters stance remains that we stand by our report and we stand by our findings. Nic, another question saying, Australia has gone up in terms of trust. Facebook is declining. Essentially, the question is, what do you see, if any, common threads where trust is increasing coupled with news-paying audiences? It sounds like Narnia, but did you find it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think publishers feel that trust is important, particularly publishers that are trying to charge for news think that trust is important. I think what we find, and in terms of getting people to pay, but I think what we find is that the motivations for paying are not purely around trust. They are about they're partly about, are you providing something of real distinctive value that you can't get for free? And then secondly, do you identify with the brand? Does the brand speak for you? So that sort of identification with the mission, supporting quality journalism is another reason why in some countries people, where they feel quality journalism is under attack. So that's another reason why people, so it's not necessarily about general trust. It may be about whether you personally feel and identify with that brand and its values, or it may be that actually you just find that it's really, really helpful for you in your job and that this information is particularly special. So I think rather than thinking about trust, which is a really complicated concept, it's probably better to think about these different types of value that you can provide and how that fits in a very crowded market.
Reiko, one of the sort of rays of hope is how audio and video is growing as a genre. I'm interested in hearing from you what's happening within the news organizations in Japan in terms of pivoting to what may be considered newer forms of engagement, whether it's podcasts or more video, because Japan is a unique market in the sense that print remains quite firmly in circulation and in consumption. Is Japan, or are newsrooms in Japan looking to do things differently?
Again, the level and the speed of how news organization has been embracing the digital technology is slower than in the Western counterparts. But one example that I picked up on finding that one major TV station has launched TikTok in 2020, and it's already reached 3 million followers in a matter of 1.5 years. And when you compare to what they did with YouTube, it took them 10 years to reach 1 million. So the level of spreading is really fast. And so I think there is a need there, interest there. And maybe it is up to the news organization to decide how you want to do stuff. Because again, when I said my country everybody like to avoid controversy or being kind of debated, we just don't like causing the stir, fuss. And that applies to not only individual levels, but also to the organization, public organizations and companies. And so it is quite slow to embrace changes because of the fear of being a failure or inviting unwanted controversy. But again, when the audiences want that, I guess it is the time for us to actually go where the audience is rather than hoping that they would find us, because I think time has already passed where we can sit back in our own old news organizations so far and then expect people to come to you. It's us about reaching to them. So we'll see, I think, in the next year or so and see how the changes will. And I do hope this digital news report will be one of the kind of drivers to invite the conversation about how we should change.
We hope so too. Next year brings us to our terrible teens. It will be the 13th DNR report, and let's see how that goes. Nic, final word with you, because I'm conscious of time. You know, on the point that Reiko raises, and I think this has come up before, go to where the audiences are, seek them out, seek to tell stories differently. Do you see something that embodies the Asia landscape when you look at overall trends as compared to other geographies? Is there something to take away from what's happening in Asia that is working for news outfits?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are in some senses greater challenges because of that dependency on the platforms. But I think what I see across the region is also partly because of the youth that we've talked about. I mean, with the exception of Japan, but in other Asian countries, very young populations, and I think there's a huge amount of innovation. The way that Filipinos and Indonesians, for example, are embracing new platforms like TikTok with storytelling. Yvonne's talked about this in the Philippines. And I think we've got a lot of variety. And I think a key thing actually is just to learn from each other, because there are things that are working in one market that could be applied to other markets. And I think quite often we've just been very, very insular, either within countries or within companies. So I think learning from each other in terms of how we can adapt to these really fundamental shifts that we talk about this year in terms of platforms in particular, I think.
Lots to mull over. Thank you, all three of you, very much for joining in with your thoughts, with all your insight. I think there's lots of rich takeaways for anyone who's been watching. And of course, you can continue to see the takeaways of this conversation on social media platforms. Surprise, surprise. Thank you, Nic. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Reiko. We'll wind it down here. Thank you for watching.
Thanks.